Eric walked briskly down the wide, sunlit street of Madison Avenue. He had lived in this city for a long time, almost 3 years. Eric had never stayed anywhere so long before, but here he felt especially cozy and warm. He liked the atmosphere here. Houses, squares, parks, spacious embankment, streets, and even people, everything seemed pleasant, bright, almost native. Eric considered this place his home. Where was his real home, though? Eric didn't know that, but he didn't give up hope that someday he would be able to find out. Eric was a man without a past. He remembered nothing at all about his life up to a certain point. About 10 years ago, Eric had suddenly found himself on the bank of a river, soaking wet and freezing. He was very sore and dizzy at the time. Everything was in a kind of fog. Eric felt a huge bleeding bump on the back of his head and sat right down on the damp sand. What was the big deal? He was already wet and dirty anyway, and it couldn't get any worse. His legs were shaking, and his sweat was pouring down. Eric tried to remember what had happened to him, who he was, how he had gotten here. He felt as if he had recently survived a death threat, and had survived. Eric even felt a kind of relief, despite the horror of the situation. Strangely, the man, no matter how much he tried, couldn't remember anything about himself except the name Eric, and even then he wasn't entirely sure. At least it was something. Let it be Eric, since nothing else came to mind. The man looked around. A deserted beach. Early morning. It was just starting to get light. There was a town in the distance. Maybe we should go there. Maybe the familiar houses and streets would awaken memories. Or maybe the people would help. Eric struggled to get up, waited for the dizziness to subside, and walked on unsteady legs toward the city. But after 100 meters, the man stopped like a stumbling block. The feeling of danger, it was back again. His heart pounded frantically. Sweat beaded on his back. What if I shouldn't go into town? What if something bad happens to me there again, he thought. Apparently, Eric was beaten up. Who did it? Why? There was no answer. The man remembered absolutely nothing about himself and could only rely on his intuition. And it told him to hide, to cover up, to disappear. There was no telling what had happened to him. What if someone was looking for him? After thinking about it, Eric headed in the opposite direction from the big city. First he walked along a deserted beach, then he crossed a vacant lot and came to a quiet country road. On one side of the path was a plantation with densely growing trees, on the other a field of tall grass. If there was the sound of a car coming down the road, Eric would just hide, because his heart was pounding too often and an unpleasant chill was churning in his stomach. All of this could only mean one thing: fear. A very strong fear, perhaps even fear for his own life. Except that Eric's intuition failed him at the time. But he would find out about it later, much later. The man had indeed had a deadly adventure, but he still should have gone to that big city. For Eric was already being searched for. Notices were posted on the streets of the towns near his small homeland. Police and volunteer teams were scouring the area. But Eric, of course, couldn't know that. His animal instincts told him to lay low. He decided to hide for now, wait for his memory to return, and then decide what to do next. The confused, exhausted man wandered along the road all day until evening. He did not feel hungry then, only thirsty. On the way he met lakes from which he drank. His mind was filled with anxious thoughts and a string of questions that had no answers. In the end, Eric was so tired that he gave up trying to remember anything about himself besides his name. Toward evening, the man stopped in a grove of birch trees across a field. The outline of another large city could be seen on the horizon. The metropolis shimmered with colorful lights. That was where Eric would go tomorrow morning. He had gone far enough away from the dangerous place, and there he could go to the police. They would figure out what to do in this difficult situation. It was July. The nights were warm and short, so Eric was not afraid of freezing. Gnats and mosquitoes were bothering him, but that was okay. Eric slept on a makeshift bed made of a pile of grass. He slept restlessly, woke up several times from disturbing sounds, listened, but then realized that it was just another big bird flying by or a car in the distance. It was no big deal. He even enjoyed sleeping like this, under the open sky. Big bright stars, crickets singing, fresh breeze. It seemed like a long time ago, or not. It's hard to make sense of it now. The next morning, Eric set out for the city. It had seemed so close the previous evening, but the man didn't get there until lunchtime. By then, his stomach was churning with hunger. The traveler had no idea how long he hadn't eaten. A day at least. On the way to the town, Eric had eaten berries and plantain, but these were mediocre sources of hunger. Here, at last, are the first human buildings. The city outskirts, not a very prosperous neighborhood. Wooden houses crumbling from time, dusty, broken sidewalks. It was here that they approached Eric, three men in dirty clothes, tanned, unkempt, shaggy and ragged homeless men. "Who are you going to be?" one of them inquired sternly. "This is our territory here. Go hobo somewhere else." Homeless. Eric only now thought about how he looked from the outside, just as dirty and ragged as these homeless people. And for what he is, he's even more desperate than they are. At least they know who they are. "Why are you the strange one?" the second stranger asked in a softer tone. "Have you been beaten, or what? By who?" And Eric told these people everything he knew. He didn't forget to mention the strange feeling of anxiety and fear that had accompanied him most of the way, and which had let go only here, away from that beach. It was unexpectedly nice to talk to someone, and the homeless people turned out to be very grateful listeners. "It's clear to me," uttered the man who had first spoken to Eric in a rather surly manner. "There's nothing to think about. You're one of us, one of the untouchables. Your clothes are tattered and dirty, and you're all overgrown and gnat-bitten. It's all just as it should be. I think you were beaten up either by the cops or by the shopkeepers where you tried to steal something. Beat you senseless and dumped you on the beach. You know, to keep you out of trouble. You never know. What if you hadn't lived? They'd be in trouble." There's plenty of stories like that on the street. It happens every day. Maybe so. Eric didn't really believe that version. That tramp is surely wrong, he thought. At least, that's what Eric hoped. "I'm going to the police station. Have them run it through their databases. Maybe someone's looking for me." The homeless men looked at each other. One of them even whistled. "You don't have to do that." Don't shook his head, the man who had been silent until then. "It's better not to be seen by our policemen at all. They are, quick to put the homeless into a workhouse under the guise of giving the homeless food, shelter, and an opportunity to earn money. Only it's slavery. One of ours escaped from there. He told me what horrors are going on there. People die like flies. They can't take the strain. And who's going to investigate? A vagrant and a vagrant. Who needs us anyway?" "There's a lot of money in it," continued the second interlocutor. "We're basically free. The labor force, the police are in on it. They're scouring the city for people like us. That's why we have to live on the outskirts, or even go into the forests when raids take place. It's even harder to live. And you say the police? They'll be as happy to see you as if you were their own. They'll send you to the workhouse today, and from there the only way out is to the cemetery. It's a miracle that our boy got out of there once." Eric thanked the men for the truth and thought about it. He had no idea what to do now. Maybe he could try to get to another town. But it was far away, and he didn't have the strength to walk. And his stomach was cramping from hunger, so much so that his eyes were dark. One of the vagrants noticed this. Hungry shook his head understandingly. "Well, come on over to our place. We're newly settled here in an abandoned old house. We'll feed you." Everyone met on the way. Nick, Sad Pete. The men had no names, only nicknames. The new acquaintances led Eric to an old wooden house. It swayed and settled from old age. The lot around it had become a lush jungle. Eric barely made his way through the thicket. The more remote and impenetrable, the better, Nick enlightened. "You can't see this house from behind the grass. It's more peaceful." "The locals have already spotted us anyway," Pete waved his hand. "Someone's going to tattle to the cops soon enough. They always do. We'll have to find a new place then." Sad sighed. "Too bad. I really like it here. It's like my grandmother's cottage in the country." "And what good was that cabin in the village?" Nick asked skeptically. "You told me yourself how they made you work there from morning till night, didn't feed you, locked you in the basement for the slightest offense, abused you, almost killed you once. That's when you started running away from your own people." "So what?" Said objected. A house is a house. Eric was finally fed. Half a loaf of black bread, liquid tea, and jam at the bottom of a 3-liter jar. It seemed like the most delicious thing he'd ever eaten in his life. Or maybe it was. Somehow it was very easy and natural for him to be in the company of these people in an abandoned house. Perhaps he was wrong, a vagrant who had been beaten to a pulp. "You don't need to get out of the way," Peter said. "Go on, make yourself comfortable wherever you like. Stay with us for now, you've got nowhere to go anyway, poor fellow." "Thank you." "So thanks, it's good of you to be there too. 4 is always better than 3. We make more money. It's safer. And you're a tough guy, you've got muscles." It was the first time Eric paid attention to his body. Indeed, his chest was bulging with muscle, and his arms had prominent biceps and triceps. How did he even know such words? Strange. "I can see you've been a mess because of handcuffs. You had to survive, climb, maybe do some hard labor. So much for the gym. No need for a membership," Peter grinned. "All right, go back to sleep. You should get some rest. We're going to work." Eric settled down on the mattressless bed and fell asleep. He woke up in a different mood. He felt strong in his arms and legs. His mind was clearer. True, the man did not remember the details of his past life. But that's all right. But now he was not alone. Strangely, what had happened before the beach was completely forgotten. Only the feeling of mortal danger and miraculous rescue, despite the lack of chances, remained. But the time from the beginning of the journey to this big and dangerous city was firmly etched in my memory, every detail, every detail. A little later, Eric's new acquaintances showed up. "Here, Eric, you look normal already, and we're in for a rich catch." The homeless were scavenging in the neighborhood, grabbing any opportunity to earn a penny or a piece of bread. The only thing that was forbidden was stealing. "If we get caught, all the locals will quickly report us to the police. And goodbye, goodbye, quiet, peaceful place. And they might beat us up or even kill us. Like you, for example." Nick, Pete, and Sad had stayed together for years on end. They survived by putting nets in the local creeks, catching crayfish and small fish. They worked part-time at the cottage community. There was always work to be found on the plots. Those who were not squeamish about homeless people assigned them simple jobs to fix the roof of the barn, paint the fence, weed the beds. They paid either in money or food. Trinity was happy with both options. In summer, everything was just fine. We could sleep under the open sky. But in winter, we had to move to the city to the heating main, otherwise you'd freeze. And there were dangers there. The cops are not nice people who see homeless people as unrequited victims. The others are vagrants, and there's no way to make a living. Unless you find something to eat from time to time in the garbage cans of a shopping center or a cafe. Not everyone survives the winter. Only the young, tough, lucky ones, like you shook his head sadly at Nick, who was clearly the leader of the 3 homeless. Lenny, my cousin's brother, died that year. The only soul made in the whole world. He was old, he was sick, he was coughing so bad. I thought it was his lungs and he was coughing. They wouldn't take us to the hospital. That's why our Lenny died of that cough. He was a good man, Sad put in. His eyes clouded over. Whether it was the memory of his dead friend or the realization that the same fate awaited them all. "Okay," Nick said. "You, Eric, what's on your mind? Where are you going? Or are you staying with us?" "With you," Eric replied without a second thought. What else could he do? The memory wasn't coming back. There was little hope that it would happen quickly. And here were kind, caring people. They obviously need each other. It's easier for the homeless to survive together. This truth suddenly popped into Eric's brain, proving once again that he was just as much a wandering vagrant as his new acquaintances. Eric and his new friends spent the whole summer in an abandoned house. Then one morning a police car appeared on the street. The homeless were just returning from a night of fishing. The catch was good. A large plastic bag found on the street was filled to the brim. Enough for a couple or 3 days of a well-fed life. Everyone was in high spirits. And then suddenly this happened. Wait froze, noticing the men in uniform, 3 vagrants. Obediently, they froze like halted. They had not yet rounded the corner of the barracks, beyond which was a view of their house. The buddies moved farther away and watched what was happening from a safe distance. The cops headed straight toward the homeless shelter. They obviously knew where to go. "Somebody from around here snitched." Nick clenched his fists. "I wish I knew who and why and to whom. We didn't seem to be in the way." It was now impossible to return to the house. The four friends spent the rest of the summer in the forest. It was not a bad time, warm, quiet, peaceful. There was enough food. Fishing and household chores at the dacha plots were very helpful. And then somehow it suddenly became noticeably colder at night. It started raining. The makeshift tent on a tree no longer saved us from the weather. "Let's go back to town," Nick decreed one morning. Eric liked life in the city much less than being on its outskirts. Noise, dirt, dark, dusty heating ducts, where rats, cockroaches, spiders lived next door to people, lack of fresh air, the need to be constantly on the lookout for police officers and aggressive homeless people. But his friends were there for him. They explained to Eric how to survive in the city, and he himself seemed to remember something from his past life on a subconscious level. He was better at navigating the dumpsters than Nick. Eric knew by some inner instinct where the right restaurants were and when there was something to eat there. Diamond-eyed Nick had praised Eric more than once. "There's a reason we met you the other day." Eric took care of his appearance much more often than his comrades in arms. He brushed his teeth, washed his face, even shaved with the tools he found in the junkyard, after treating them with vodka, of course. Every evening and morning, Eric washed his face with snow, rainwater, water from the fountain. If he wanted, he could even take an improvised bath. The first winter wasn't easy for Eric. It turned out that he was completely unprepared for it. It was strange, considering that the man seemed to have spent his whole life on the streets. Eric took care of his appearance much more often than his comrades in arms. He brushed his teeth, washed his face, even shaved with the tools he found in the junkyard, after treating them with vodka, of course. Every evening and morning, Eric washed his face with snow, rainwater, water from the fountain. If he wanted, he could even take an improvised bath. The first winter wasn't easy for Eric. It turned out that he was completely unprepared for it. Strange, considering that the man seemed to have spent his entire life on the streets. Or had he? How do we find out now? You can't go to the police. They'll definitely think he's a vagrant, which in fact he is, and the authorities have a short conversation with the homeless. They're free labor, unaccounted for human souls. You can do what you want with them. It's scary. As Nick had warned, not everyone survived the winter. In February, Sed fell seriously ill. His friends treated him as best they could, drinking hot water and feeding him hard. But the man was coughing, burning with fever, then even delirious. He kept remembering his grandmother from the village, asking her not to beat him, swearing that he was not guilty of anything. That was the first and only time Eric had ever dared to steal. Afterward, he berated himself for the act, especially since it didn't help. But at that moment, it seemed to him that he was doing the right thing. At first, Eric just asked for alms outside the supermarket. But just as Nick had warned him, people like him were reluctant to give. Healthy forehead, work, the old ladies grumbled. Eric would be glad to work, but who would hire him without a residence permit, without documents? Who needs him? It's a free summer. Private farms always need free hands. What about now? Then Eric got desperate. Sed didn't have time to wait. He needed medicine right away. Eric even knew what kind of antibiotics. How did he know that? Apparently, he'd lived in a normal environment before he hit the streets, a long time ago. Anyway, Eric pulled his wallet out of the absent-minded guy's pocket. He was walking down the street, staring at his phone, oblivious to everything around him. The wallet practically fell out of the back pocket of his jeans. Eric only had to reach for it, and he did, cursing himself with the last words. But his friend needs medicine, and he's dying. Except no one believes his words. Passers-by are sure that the homeless man is nagging for a bottle. There wasn't much money in the wallet, but there was enough for the medicine, and even some bread and cheap sausage. The pills seemed to make Sad feel better at first, and everyone believed in a happy outcome. But after a couple of days, the disease took its toll. Nick found his friend's breathless body in the evening when he came back from fishing. They buried him in a vacant lot outside of town. It was hard digging, but the buddies managed. All three of them were silent. Only occasionally they exchanged short phrases, and even then only on business. Back on the heating duct, Nick told Sad's story. The boy was born into a dysfunctional family, drunken parents, many children, and an extra mouth. The youngest son was often taken in by his grandmother, Pete's father's mother. Pete, of course, had a real name at the time, David. The grandmother was religious, and in a very strange way. In everything the boy did or said, she saw signs that he was possessed by devils. So the old woman tried to exorcise the evil power from her grandson, and her fanatical neighbors helped her do it. David was beaten, starved, kept in a dark basement for days on end, all for his own good. He didn't go to school so he wouldn't be exposed to the corrosive influences of youth. His grandmother intended to make a pious man out of her youngest grandson so that he would not be like his mother and father. And the parents? They didn't care what happened to their son. His grandmother took him away, and that was fine. It was less trouble for them. David, of course, complained to his mother and father, tried to explain how badly he was living with his grandmother. But they wouldn't listen. They also scolded their son for not feeling grateful to his grandmother for everything she does for him. So the boy started to run away from home. The first time he was returned to his grandmother, after which she beat her grandson so that he could not sit down for a long time. The second time the same thing happened, and the third time David was never found. He had already gained experience and understood how to hide so that you would not be found out and caught. Freedom surrounded the boy's head. It was better on the street than at home. That's how he became with the Chinaman. And now it's all sad. Nick bowed his head. I've run out of steam. We all end up like that sooner or later. Either disease kills us or someone kills us. Eric thought for the first time not about his past, but about his future. Could this be the life that awaited him too? Most likely he will, because he has no papers. If you have no documents, then you are a nobody. They won't hire you for a job or admit you to a hospital. Survive as you know how. Winter passed, summer passed, it became much easier. The trio moved closer to the outskirts of the city again. They occupied an abandoned house not far from the dacha plots. Eric had gotten quite used to this life. Wandering, random earnings, constant danger. The man realized one thing: a man can remain in any situation and under any conditions. It calmed him down, gave him hope. The memory was still not coming back. Eric was not particularly worried about it now. There was no time for idle thoughts and worries. He had to survive. Several years passed. Nick, Pete, and Eric were still together. They managed to survive the winter, supporting each other and taking care of each other. They became real friends, relatives, maybe even brothers. At least Eric couldn't imagine himself without them anymore. Nick, who always had a clear plan of action, and good-natured Pete made up his family. But one dark August night there was a raid. Someone had called the police again after noticing that there were homeless people living near the village. Eric still shuddered at the memory of that moment. The early morning light from the headlights of the police cars was scattered. From the loudspeaker came the harsh words, "Come out one by one. It is useless to resist," but they resisted nonetheless. Desperately resisting, not wanting to get into a vacant house. They tried to escape through a hole in the old fence, but, as it turned out, two strong men in uniform were already waiting for them there. Nick was the first to be grabbed. Pete and Eric stopped in indecision, looking at their leader confusedly. "Run, you fools!" Nick, who already had his hands twisted behind his back, shrieked frantically. And Eric ran. He ran so fast that the wind whistled in his ears. He had to save himself, to get as far away from this terrible place as possible, to hide in the forest, which was a dark ribbon on the horizon. Pete kept falling behind. Eric was the most athletic of the three. Probably wrong. He'd once had to do physical labor for long periods of time because of his muscles. Eric was the possessor of a relief muscle, incredible stamina, as an athlete. The man could run fast and long, knew how to kick and punch. Maybe he had a troubled past. He learned it on the street. He's used those skills many times. And now, the cop turned out to be an excellent runner. He caught up with Pete, who was panting from running so fast. Soon the other policemen caught up with them, who were already rushing after the fugitives. Pete wasn't going anywhere. Eric, on the other hand, had clearly slipped away. The uniformed guy finally caught up with. Eric grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and yanked him toward him. He had a lot of strength. Eric tried his best to break free, to no avail, and then his body went automatic again, as it had done so many times before. His hands grabbed his opponent's chest, and his legs performed some kind of a strange move. And already the policeman, confused and surprised, lay straight on the grass and looked up at the sky. "Hurry up! Come on, they're coming!" shouted Eric to Pete. But looking at his comrade, the man realized that he could not run any faster. There was no way he could do it at all. "Eric, you run this, and I'm done." "No more strength," Pete whispered with difficulty, breathing heavily, and collapsed on the grass. "Come on, pull yourself together," Eric exhorted. He even went up to his comrade and took him in his arms, intending to escape with him into the woods. The policeman remained lying in the grass for the time being, but his colleagues were rapidly approaching from the direction of the village. It was no use. It was Pete who pushed him away. "You go and save yourself, or they'll all be captured together." "I can't do it anymore," he said. Eric realized that Pete was right. It was very hard to leave a man with whom so many connected so completely alone. But what could be done? No one would be better off if he too was captured. So the man set off again toward the forest. The saving thicket was quite close there. He would not find it there. The densely growing trees, the bushes, the storms, the crowbar. The dog would be needed, but not until they got him to the spot. Eric's gone. That morning, Eric was lost in the thicket, deep in the woods, lurking like a wounded animal. He walked for a long time, trying to get as far away from the pursuit as possible. By noon, the man was completely exhausted. Seeing an old thick tree with a convenient fork, as if specially created for tired travelers d'Izankoi, Eric climbed it and fell into a deep, restless sleep. The man woke up in the evening. It was getting colder. August nights are quite fresh. Besides, his stomach was cramped from hunger. Eric refreshed himself with the gifts of the forest. There was a thicket of blackberries just under his tree. And he moved on. He must find a new home, a new town. He's all alone now, with no friends. It's bad, it's sad, it's hard. What's happening to them now? They've probably already been sent to that house with no way out. Eric saw it once. This place is scary. A tall cement fence with barbed wire running along the top. Maybe it was electrified too. No, there's no way out of that house. And Eric can't help his comrades if he wants to. We can only hope that the rumors about the house are exaggerated, and his friends will not be there as bad as they imagined. Eric himself, he needs to get into town. You can still live outdoors in the summer, but it'll be cold soon. You can't stay outdoors in the cold. It is necessary to move to warm places closer to human habitation and garbage cans, where there is always enough food to keep a homeless person from starving to death. How to survive on the streets. This Eric already knew very well. He wasn't worried about himself, but his friends were sorely lacking. The man was used to the fact that they were always together and would support each other with a word and argue sometimes. And now? Now what? He was all alone on the planet again. The man thought that he may have friends and relatives, about whom he does not remember anything at all. But the memory never came back. Eric walked out after a few days to the new town, found a place to stay, looked around, figured out where he could get some scraps. He saw other homeless people. Some were very friendly and some were belligerent. You had to be on your guard at all times. But the man never joined anyone else. Didn't have the chance. He tried to maintain friendly relations with everyone, but mostly he kept to himself. The years passed. Eric got used to his vagabond life. Every once in a while he'd leave another town and move on. Why? The man didn't know it himself. His living conditions were the same everywhere. Probably he just wanted to see the world, new places, new faces, interesting landscapes. It's always so interesting. And then 3 years ago, Eric suddenly found himself in Westham. It seemed to him that he had been here once before in a previous life, or somewhere very similar. The cityscape seemed vaguely familiar. The very atmosphere of the town was soothing, warm, and inviting. The man immediately realized that he would stay here for a long time. And so he did. 3 years had already passed, and he didn't want to leave Westham in search of a better life. And why should I? Eric settled in. He has almost a real apartment, a room under the stairs in an old 3-story house from the emergency fund, where no one lived. This household was run by a man from the department who let the homeless man into this room. "Live here for now," he said, "but if anything, there will be an inspection or you'll have to move people in. You'll have to go back on the street again." So Eric lived here in the neighborhood and he was very happy. He finally had a real room with a bed, a table, and even a small refrigerator. Steve, that was the name of the man who helped Eric find a shelter. He had tried to get him a job as a janitor, but he needed papers, official paperwork. What kind of paperwork does a drifter have? It didn't work out. Steve and Eric couldn't be friends. Their social statuses were too different. One day, a homeless man drove a pack of dogs away from an old woman in front of Steve. Many people saw that the animals were about to attack the old woman, but no one dared to help. Eric had lived on the street for a long time and knew how to act in such a situation. The rescued old lady, without having time to thank, immediately disappeared into the entranceway. Steve, who happened to witness this scene, approached the hero, praised him for his courage, and made an offer that Eric could not refuse. "I've been watching you for a long time," Steve said, shaking the homeless man's hand. "You don't look like the usual bums. Tidy, polite, respectful. Didn't pass by someone else's misfortune. And what will you do in the winter? A heating duct." Eric shrugged. He'd been through more than one winter before and knew exactly how to deal with the onset of cold weather. "I've got the emergency fund standing derelict," Steve continued. "There's a room under the stairs. I can let you in there, temporarily, of course. I can't give you an apartment, but you can live in the room under the stairs and live in peace." So Eric had a decent place to live. It took a long time for the man to get used to his new corner. Sleeping on a real bed was a real joy. It was a real blessing to eat dinner at the table, take a shower, and not flinch at every accidental rustle. It was a little scary to live in an empty 3-story apartment building, like a haunted castle, but it was much better than living in the open air. Eric loved his room and was very grateful to Steve for the accommodations. The men talked occasionally when they crossed paths on the street, which was not uncommon. Steve's house was not far from the emergency fund. "I look at you and I don't understand. Do you really not know your past?" asked Steve. "No, I don't know," replied Eric. "I don't remember anything at all. It shouldn't be like this." "We should go to the police," suggested Steve. "Don't," said Eric. "Over the years of living on the street, I've learned to be wary of cops. And so many years have passed. Maybe someone was once looking for me, but surely all searches have stopped now. Just kidding. It's been more than 10 years since I found myself on the riverbank." "Well, do you know," agreed Steve. "Only I'd do things differently if I were you." Eric had almost a real job after all. Unofficial, of course, but permanent. A truckload of groceries arrived at the local supermarket at the same time 3 times a week. The girls, salesmen, and cashiers were supposed to unload it, but the girls did not have enough strength. The hard work was clearly not for women's hands. One day, seeing how the salesmen in the store's branded clothing agonizing with all these boxes, Eric could not stand it, rushed to their aid. It wasn't difficult for him. The man was not a stranger to physical work, and he had enough strength. "Thank you," one of the girls smiled embarrassedly when the deed was done and handed the man a bag full of groceries. "This is almost expired. It expires in a couple days. But these groceries are tasty good. We also take them home when we write off the expiration date. So don't be afraid, eat up." "Thank you," smiled Eric. The man hadn't been squeamish about treats from dumpsters for years, and he didn't think to be afraid. It had been a long time since the man had eaten proper food, and here was sausage, bread, and some canned goods. Also, "Would you mind coming over the day after tomorrow? At the same time, the truck will come again, and we ourselves, you see what kind of movers we are." Gladly, of course, he agreed, and so it went. Now 3 times a week at the same time, the man went to the supermarket and unloaded a truck, then received a huge bag of food. Eric had a place to live. He had completely forgotten about hunger and the dangers of the street. Of course, the man realized that such a life would end someday, but what will be, will be. He wasn't used to surviving on the streets either. For now, Eric was enjoying his well-being. He had plenty of free time now. The man liked to just walk around the city, the center, the outskirts, the waterfront, the suburban area. Everything here was nice and pleasant. Occasionally, Eric found a little part-time work, same as before. Small errands mostly for people in the private sector. He was happily trusted with the work. Unlike other homeless people, Eric looked much better groomed, decent and generally more trustworthy. With the money he earned, the man bought some medicines, some clothes. Once he saw an album with expensive art pencils in the store and could not resist. He spent all his earnings on this beauty. Eric was surprised to find out that he could draw. From under his hands began to come out wonderful paintings, mostly urban and rural landscapes. Everything that Eric had once seen beautiful, everything that had once struck his imagination, was now transferred to paper. "Oh, you're an artist too," "Are you?" marveled Steve, coming in to check on his ward one day and noticing the paintings on his desk. "I don't know," Eric shrugged. "Interesting personality." "I'd very much like to know what happened to you in the past," muttered Steve thoughtfully. Eric wanted it too. But on the other hand, there was also fear. What if he found out something bad about himself? What if he'd done something terrible in his past life? Someone had chased him, tried to hurt him. He got hit on the head. It didn't just happen. Maybe it's better not to know anything about what happened before, Eric said thoughtfully. To live in peace. Especially since life is kind of back to normal. Eric's even made some friends because it's hard to live alone. Steve? No, you couldn't really call him a friend. More like a patron. But the local janitors, the supermarket security guard, the lonely grandfather from the neighboring house, all these people now often came to visit Eric. And he was glad that he finally had a place where he could invite guests. On this sunny morning, Eric was just rushing to his main job at the supermarket. The truck would be arriving soon. Today the man is a little late. He stayed up late working on another drawing, so he overslept. But that's okay. He just needs to push on. He'll make it. Eric approached the road. A busy intersection. Active traffic on the roadway at all hours of the day and night. Cars whizzed by at high speeds. Dangerous place. A man had been run over once. It happened right in front of Eric. The man was just running down the street in a hurry to run the green light. And this guy, he was just crossing the street. It's a crosswalk and a green light. And there's this foreign car. The driver didn't even slow down. The teenager flew up like a wooden doll, flew a few meters, and then fell right on the asphalt. Eric turned around sharply and went the other way. He couldn't see it, didn't want to. His heart was pounding frantically. Tears were pouring from his eyes. He felt so sorry for the kid. After a while, a funeral wreath appeared on a pole near the crossing. It hung there for a few months, then disappeared. But Eric was near the place now. He was especially careful until he was sure that all cars stopped on the zebra. He would not step a foot. So today, just like that, he stopped far from the road and looked over to the traffic light. The light was red. We have to wait. The man was alone here. That's the time. It's not rush hour. Not a lot of people on the streets. And then Eric's sensitive ears picked up a strange sound, the sound of wheels hitting the pavement. It was nothing, but the noise was getting closer. The speed of the object seemed to be increasing, but the road next to it was red, and cars were speeding past at breakneck speed. Eric turned around just in time. The kid on the scooter would fly into the roadway. He'd have no chance. The kid did get past Eric. He couldn't react immediately. A car was coming straight at the boy. The man had time to notice the horror on the face of the driver, a young woman. Eric, risking himself, jumped to the road, grabbed the boy by the scruff of the neck, and literally threw him on the sidewalk. He immediately jumped after him. The car still caught him slightly at that speed, and the light impact was sensitive. Eric went down. The car stopped a little farther away. There was a loud squeal of brakes. A female driver was already rushing toward Eric and the boy lying on the pavement. "What's wrong with the baby?" was the first thing she exclaimed. "I hit him, he's fine," Eric assured her, rubbing his bruises. "It's a long spot. I grabbed him out from under the tires in time. The kid wasn't hurt. What luck." The woman was ready to burst into tears. "And you? Are you all right?" Eric nodded silently. He would not tell this already frightened woman that he had a huge bruise on his thigh right now, and he would probably limp for a long time. "It's nothing. It's a mundane matter. It'll heal like a dog." "What are you doing?" The lady's anger turned on the boy. Don't you know you have to cross the road on green? Big so big you still haven't learned. The kid looked like a hunted animal. He was about 10 years old. It looked like it. The boy was only now beginning to realize what he had avoided. Eric felt sorry for the hapless racer. Well, he forgot himself. That's all right. The main thing is that everything is all right, the woman agreed. It's lucky you were there. The boy was lucky. Unlike his scooter, all three of us looked at the scooter, which was under the wheels of the car. But so, do we call the police? An ambulance? Or the woman looked questioningly at the others involved in the incident. Sounds like it turned out okay to me, Eric shrugged. The boy nodded his head, confirming his agreement. Well, I'll be on my way then. I'm late for an important meeting, the woman said. And then she looked at the boy and added in a stern voice, and let all this be a good lesson to you. Next time the kind uncle may not be around, or he may not have time to react, the woman left. Eric pulled the still mode scooter onto the sidewalk and scratched the back of his head, puzzled. Your vehicle is beyond repair. There's no fixing it now, so be it, exclaimed the boy, having been silent until that moment. My father will buy me a new one. He's not a pauper or anything. I doubt he would if he knew the truth. Shook his head at Eric. He didn't like the word pauper coming out of the kid's mouth. Isn't that a little arrogant or something? The boy must be living in a wealthy family. He and the clothes he's wearing are obviously expensive. He is spoiled and treats those lower in social status with disdain. And yet his savior is even worse than a beggar, a homeless man with no past. And thank you so much. Tears welled up in the boy's voice. He looked at Eric with such sincere gratitude that the man realized he had jumped to conclusions. Boy, the kid seems like a pretty good kid. You're welcome, Eric smiled. But don't ever do that again. You know to cross the road on green, don't you? Yes, I know, of course. The boy waved his hand. That's not the point. Is it? Eric wondered. He wanted to talk to this kid a little more, help him distress after what happened, make sure he was okay before he let him go on alone. Not much of a chance. My dad ordered me a new scooter from America. It's awesome. No one else in town has one. Although now I don't have one either. Oh well, my dad's gonna order it again. Anyway, it's got this really cool braking system. I practiced it. It worked in the yard. The scooter would stop on the playground, just in 1 second, no matter how fast I accelerated. How cool is that? But let's say Eric agreed. He was beginning to realize what his young interlocutor was getting at. Well, that's the way I wanted to slow down before the road. It worked before, but here nothing. I just kept on rolling. And I had already gained a decent speed, flew right under the wheels and could not do anything. Well, I would have jumped off it, and that's it, the boy shared. Eric looked absent-mindedly at the boy. Life is more precious than any iron, he said. Yeah, I know, the kid sighed and guessed. It was just so scary to move and think straight. Didn't numb the body. Yeah, well, sort of. I see, Eric nodded. And the scooter didn't stop? Do you know why? You didn't take into account the fact that the road goes uphill here. And you probably tested your transportation on flat ground. Eric asked. That's right. It's like the kid had an epiphany, the boy smiled. I didn't think of that. Well, that's just it. Be more careful from now on. Well, it happens, wait. You can't do that. You saved my life, and I don't even know your name, the boy expressed his gratitude. My name is Eric. Eric introduced himself. Wow, me too, the boy exclaimed. Eric's, you and me then. Eric smiled. He was liking this boy more and more, a sweet, genuine, grateful, good kid. He should have thought badly of him at first. Come with me, the boy suddenly pleaded. Come, my father's office is near here. He knows how rich I am? He has his own restaurant. Maybe you know what the urban legend is called? Loud name, Eric smiled. Of course he knew the place. He'd walked past it a few times. It was where the local elite usually gathered. The restaurant was upscale, though Eric didn't need to inspect the trash cans near the eateries now. He went around Westham as a matter of habit, noting where the local cafes and restaurants were located, just in case. Yeah, cool name, agreed little Eric. His dad came up with it, and his friend's companion, that is. Well, that's all great, but I've got to go, Eric realized. He remembered that he was already late for the supermarket. The truck would be here soon, and the man was not in the habit of letting people down. And he was only late once, late twice, and the job that's been feeding him for so many years. You can lose it. In this business, diligence and punctuality are important. Well, how about that? Eric said, upset. I should definitely introduce you to your father and tell him what happened. Will he thank you? He'll be, so glad you saved me. I didn't do anything wrong, and it's about time I did. Yep, didn't make you limp. Now you have an injury because of me. Please come with me to your father. I don't have time, kid. I'm in a hurry to get to work. The best thanks I can get is your promise to be careful from now on. I'll be careful. I promise, assured the boy. Just make sure you promise too. Let's meet here tonight at 6 p.m. I'll talk to my father and he'll come with me, and thank you, please. That's unnecessary, Eric tried to fight back. It ended well, but you saved my life, the boy exclaimed. Promise me you'll come. There was so much pleading in his gaze, so much hope, that Eric couldn't refuse the boy. All right, Eric agreed. Eric was mortified by his freckles. A wide smile flooded his blank face. I'll see you tonight. Then the boy waved goodbye to his savior and raced up the street. Alive, healthy, and cheerful, Eric glanced again at his so far regimented namesake on his scooter by the roadside. He thought about what might have happened, then perked up and hurried toward the supermarket. The man limped badly, his hip aching, but there was no fracture. I apologize for the oversight. Here is the corrected text. That's for sure, which means it's no big deal. It'll heal quickly, Eric said about the abrasions on his legs. Eric was hurrying to the supermarket, while his young namesake was rushing to his father's office. The building where it was located was literally on the next street to the place where the tragedy had almost happened. Eric was so excited about this. A scooter. The boy always had plenty of toys. His father bought his son anything he wanted, but a scooter like this, not only in the city but in the country. The boy could do such spectacular tricks on it that he had never dared to dream of before. His mother, looking at these tricks, clutched at her heart. But his father was happy that his son is growing up so brave and agile. He always supported and encouraged the hobby of his only child. The family lived in a large house with a beautifully tended garden. Eric's mother did not work, was engaged in the household and with her son. But the father constantly, then on business trips, flew away, then in the office disappeared day and night. Business required his constant participation. The boy lacked his father's attention. He often missed him, and therefore used any suitable excuse to visit his parent in the office. This is a wonderful opportunity to see my father. Of course, a parent should know about what almost happened. To criticize, of course, for carelessness, of course. Maybe he won't buy a scooter like that again. But the father must know who saved the life of his son and him. He'll thank Eric, of course. He'll give him a lot of money. And Eric obviously needs it. Eric is not small, immediately realized that the man who snatched him from under the wheels of the car is in great need. He's probably homeless. There's a lot of them in America. Eric could use the money. Hi, Eric nodded to the girl at the front desk. When she saw the boy, she immediately contacted his father on the intercom. Mr. Standler, your son is here to see you, said the receptionist. Let it pass, he replied. Eric zipped up to the 4th floor in seconds. His father was already waiting for him. So how are you doing, son? Smiled the man from behind his desk, then added anxiously, what happened to you? Your legs are all abrasions. Dad, Eric exclaimed. Here's the thing. He told his father, worried and confused, of the recent incident. John Sandler's face grew paler and paler as he told him. You see, Dad, I want you to thank him. Let's give him money, lots of it. He's homeless and he really needs it. He won't take any, but you come with me tonight to that crosswalk and tell him Eric insisted. Son, you see, here's the thing, Anton began. He was still shaken by his son's account of what might have happened if it hadn't been for this homeless man. Money. Today you have it, tomorrow you don't. No matter how much you give it, it'll run out quickly anyway. It'll scatter. What about then? Eric asked. I'll hire him at our restaurant, help him get his papers. If he is homeless, he is unlikely to have his papers in order, and without them, no one will hire him and no one will treat him if he gets sick. So the man wanders, and he's a good man, if risking himself, you fool, and snatched you from under the wheels. There aren't many like him nowadays, and we'll give him a ticket to life, a chance to become a full-fledged member of society. How he takes that chance is up to him, but it's much better than just money." "You're right, Dad," Eric nodded. "Eric's a really good man. He must be in some kind of trouble to be homeless, and we're going to help him get back to a normal life. How's that for a plan?" "Fine," Dad agreed. "That's good. So what time did you agree to meet there?" "At 6, Eric replied. "Then be at my office at 6:30. We'll go together to thank your Savior," John concluded. "I want to shake his hand." "Yay," exclaimed the boy. "Now go home, be careful. Or let me get a driver to take you," Anton suggested. "No, I'll take a walk." "Don't worry, you know how careful I'll be now. 100,000 times more careful than before," Eric assured me. When Eric arrived at his father's office at the appointed time, he was not found there. "Mr. Standler is away for an important meeting in the administration," the reception girl explained. "But don't worry, he hasn't forgotten about your arrangement. Bill is up to date on all of this. He'll go with you. Where did you arrange to go?" Eric sighed. Bill was certainly a nice guy, young, funny, always able to tell a joke, and he treated Eric well. He had a son the same age as Eric. Bill was his father's assistant, his right-hand man, especially when it came to individual errands, like this one. But still, the father. I wish he'd gone to see the homeless man himself. It would have been better, because it was his son. Eric wasn't used to being upset and cranky for long, so 5 minutes later he was laughing at Matthew's jokes as he walked with him to the crosswalk. Eric Sr. arrived at the agreed place much earlier than 6 in the evening. He felt awkward, standing there, waiting to be thanked for saving the child. Any normal person would have done the same thing. It's a normal thing, a natural thing. What kind of gratitude could there be? But Eric promised the boy, and he's going to show up, waiting, upset. No, if you've promised him, be kind enough to show up. The man spotted them from afar, the boy and his escort hurrying down the street toward him. Both of them were smiling. It was obvious that they had a great relationship. "Hey," the younger man suddenly turned to Eric and hugged him around the waist. The man rubbed the boy's head awkwardly. Hey, namesake." "Hello," Bill said, shaking Eric's hand. "On behalf of this young man's father, I want to thank you for saving the boy. It's a great good fortune for all of us that you happened to be around. So you didn't?" "No, I'm not his father. Mr. Stedler wanted to come in person to meet you, but urgent business." "I understand all that. Of course you're welcome. Anyone would have done that in my place. I just happened to be there, that's all. The boy was so insistent that I come. I couldn't refuse." "And it was right to insist," Bill smiled. "We have a whole plan for how to thank you." And John Stendler's assistant told Eric everything that he would now be working at Urban Legend as a groundskeeper, that his salary would be above the city average, and that John planned to do the paperwork that would make Eric a full-fledged member of society. "What is this? Is this all true?" Eric couldn't believe his ears. "But with the job, I see. But the documents, is that possible? To get a passport, to be legalized, to become a person not only in essence, but also in documents, it was Eric's long-time dream. Except that until now, the man had thought it was impossible. And then suddenly, "Nothing is impossible for Mr. Standler," Bill smiled. And so once again, Eric's life began anew. Now the man came to the City Legend restaurant every morning. He spent his working hours mainly in the kitchen, in the back rooms, and on the adjacent territory. Cleaning, taking out heavy trash, mopping the floors, keeping an eye on the plantings, a little bit of everything. The restaurant staff were suspicious of the new employee at first. "What do you mean? A vagrant from the street? How could John even think of hiring someone like that? Yeah, he saved his boy, pulled him out from under a tire. Well, he could have paid him off, that's all." But gradually, Eric proved to be a conscientious worker, a good person, a pleasant conversationalist. He never refused to help his colleagues and could lighten the mood with an appropriate joke. The new employee did his work carefully and thoroughly, so that soon he had some well-wishers and even friends at his new place. Little Eric often came to the restaurant to say hello to his savior and to find out how he was doing. A bright and very nice kid. The man would sometimes tell him about life on the street. He avoided particularly scary and unpleasant moments. It seemed almost like an adventure, a fairy tale with a happy ending. A happy one, of course. After all, the former drifter now sleeps in a den under the stairs and works at an upscale establishment. Taylor. Who knew? Yeah, John kept his promise. Eric got his passport. The man almost cried the first time he held it in his hands. It meant a lot to him. He was no longer invisible, but a full-fledged citizen of his country with all the rights he was entitled to. Eric had no idea how the chief had done it, and he would have liked to thank John personally. But the boss never showed up at the restaurant. He passed his orders through his assistant, Bill. Eric had made friends with Bill, and they were now getting along without formalities. The documents for the new employee John also sent with him. Now Eric had a surname, Eric Taylor, accordingly. He was registered in some little house on the outskirts of the city. That was it. A real man, albeit without a past, but not invisible. No longer a vagrant off the street. To say thank you personally to the master, Eric cheered, looking at the new document. He doesn't come here much at all, Bill shook his head. What's he got to do here? He does all his business from the office, traveling on business. Do you know how much trouble he's in right now? We're expanding, opening branches in different cities. John's at work day and night. Little Eric fully confirmed this information. He had complained to his older friend more than once that he missed his father because he had no time to spend with his family. So all the business in the urban legend was actually run by Bill under the remote management of John. Upon receiving his first paycheck, Eric thought there was some kind of mistake. He was handed a puffy envelope full of large bills. The man had never held such money in his life and had no idea what to do with it. No, that's right, Bill smiled, to which Eric approached with a question. We hope it's okay. Buy yourself everything you need to live, but save up little by little too. That way you'll slowly save up for some place to live. The prospects were dizzying. Could it really be possible? Eric had a stable official job, a high salary and documents, and soon he would have his own place to live. Not so long ago, Eric could not even dream about it. He was cautious about the future, but now everything has changed. Now you can go to the doctor. Talk about this whole memory thing. Maybe there was a drug that would help him remember what had happened before the moment when Eric, beaten and soaked, woke up on the deserted beach. But the man was in no hurry to go to the hospital. There was always something to do and some excuse. Eric was still very afraid to learn the truth about himself. There was no telling what had happened before. The man was quite satisfied with his life now. He was afraid, desperately afraid of destroying this idol, of losing everything that fate had bestowed upon him. Maybe the fog of oblivion was the best thing that could happen. Maybe Eric would be happier and calmer if he didn't dredge up the past. One early morning, the kitchen supervisor sent Eric to the VIP room. One of the cleaners had suddenly fallen ill, and the place needed to be cleaned before the evening. Eric, taking a bucket, a mop, rags, and cleaning supplies, went to the hall. He'd never been here before, only peeked through the door occasionally as he passed by. Now he had a chance to take a closer look at the room. Expensive, fine furniture from Italy, smooth, shining floor, massive chandeliers, everything here was luxurious and rich. But of course it was, because this was the room where the elite usually gathered. Eric's attention was drawn to the paintings on the walls. They were drawings made with watercolors and pencils. They must be the work of a famous artist if they were here. That's strange. It felt as if Eric had seen these paintings somewhere before. Moreover, the artist was clearly working in a manner similar to Eric's own. The painter chose the same subjects: simple landscapes, human faces, animals in motion. Eric was interested. He wanted to know who the author of these works was. He walked around the room, hoping to see the artist's name on one of the drawings. He didn't know, didn't even realize that he was being watched at that very moment. John was somewhat concerned about how things were going at his brainchild, Urban Legend. The man had recently thrown all his energies into the design and development of branches. Just kidding, now he has not just a restaurant in his hands, but a whole network of such establishments, almost an empire. He doesn't see his son. His wife will soon forget what her husband looks like. It's nothing, it's just a busy period. It's hard to carry such a load alone without a loyal companion you can trust. But a little time will pass, and everything will return to normal and settle down. We should go on vacation with the family, relax together on the ocean, rest, be together. Otherwise, what was money for? John once thought that money was the most important thing in life. Without it, you're nothing, like a defenseless little bug. What else could a boy from a poor family think? Little John had no decent clothes, no textbooks, no food. There were no toys and other childish joys to speak of. John's father was a classic alcoholic, drinking, not working at times, driving the whole family around in the evenings. His mother put up with it all without complaint, and even, as John realized later, felt a kind of pride that she was so patient. Neither spouse cared about her son. John, although not an orphan, grew up with living parents, like a weed, and felt very unhappy. Once upon a time, John and his best friend, a kid from a similarly impoverished family, vowed that he would not live like his parents. "We'll have lots of money, we'll be great businessmen," the boy looked at his buddy with burning eyes. "We'll be strong, we'll be respected and feared by everyone. Also, we're going to be kind and help anyone who's having a hard time," Buddy added at the time. The neighbor boy was as smart as John himself, so there was never a dull moment with him. Far from it. Their little heads were always coming up with interesting ideas. But John's companion was also soft-hearted and kind-hearted. He was always feeling sorry for someone, always eager to save someone. A good quality, valuable, rare. But it did not bring him to good in the end. Remembering his childhood friend, John sighed heavily. It had been so long, and the story still hadn't let him go. His heart ached, his soul torn by the unknown. There was still no clarity. The man banished the sad thoughts and focused on the matter at hand. He had always been able to pull himself together, to concentrate on problems, to discard all unnecessary things. That was probably why he had reached such heights. Right now, what was bothering him was that the revenue from City Legend had plummeted. What was wrong? Maybe it was time to change the menu, or the design was outdated, or something with the staff. We need to find out why diners are now choosing to dine at the competitors. John decided to scrutinize the latest security footage. He's attentive, sensitive, he's bound to figure out what's going on. Especially since this was not the first time this had happened. The man turned on the real-time recording. "First, we need to look at the room now, when there's no one there. Early morning is the best time." John immediately noticed the new janitor. The man had saved his only son. The man was going to meet him to thank him in person. But he didn't have time for his family, so John put it off until later. Eric, unaware that he was being watched, continued to study the paintings on the walls. He looked for the artist's name on them, trying to figure out how he knew them. Everything about them seemed close and familiar. The subtlety of the lines, the colors, the subjects, all of it echoed in Eric's soul, awakening vague memories. John, watching him, suddenly remembered his childhood friend. These pictures reminded him of those carefree days when the two of them dreamed of a better life. But how did this man end up here in his restaurant? And why was his style so reminiscent of his friends? These questions were increasingly troubling John. He decided that he needed to find the time to talk to this man as soon as possible. Would he be able to? The man's conscience was clear. He had done everything he could for this man. He'd even gotten him papers, even though it wasn't easy, and it wasn't cheap. That's why John now saw the new employee for the first time. What a tramp. He's interested in painting. He's looking at paintings. Eric stepped closer to the camera. His face appeared on the screen in close-up. The host of Urban Legend was literally stunned. "No, this can't be happening. It doesn't happen like this. This is a mistake." But the longer John stared into the janitor's face, the clearer he realized no. There was no mistake. The man's heart was pounding so hard it looked like it was about to jump out of his chest. John jumped up from his chair, where he'd intended to spend the day checking reports. No time for that now. He grabbed his car keys from the desk and, without waiting for the elevator, rushed down the stairs on foot. Eric made quick work of the cleanup. Bill let him rest before his new task. In the meantime, the man was enjoying his respite, sitting on one of the benches in the garden in front of the restaurant. John spotted him as soon as he entered the gates of the urban legend. The man had never complained about his eyesight, so he could make out the janitor perfectly well from this distance. Yes, it was definitely him. A chill ran down his spine. His brain was still refusing to accept the obvious. John took a couple of breaths to pull himself together and walked slowly toward the janitor. "Hello," said the owner of the restaurant, scrutinizing Eric's face. "Hello," the janitor jumped up from his seat. He knew at once who was in front of him. John's pictures were occasionally in the press and advertisements, and little Eric often showed his older friend pictures of his father. Nice to finally meet you in person," John smiled, extending his hand to Eric. "Likewise. I have long wanted to thank you for giving me a chance at a normal life. It's the least I could do for you for saving my son. My wife and I have one," John said, still studying Eric's face. "I don't know how we would have gotten through all this. He's a great kid." Eric smiled warmly. "Yes," agreed John. "Just a little fast, too fast. Well, I used to be like that myself. And you, they say you don't remember anything about your past." Eric shook his head. "I woke up one day on a deserted beach. I think I had been hit on the head. There was a big mistake on the back of my head, and I couldn't remember anything about myself at all, except my name. Been writing ever since. Eric." John suddenly grabbed his interlocutor by the shoulders. "Take a good look at me. Look at me. Really? You don't remember anything at all?" Eric slammed his eyes shut confusedly. A whole range of emotions, surprise, anxiety, and a sense of something big. And yes, indeed, John's face seemed vaguely familiar to Eric. Somewhere he had definitely seen him once before. On the other hand, of course, he had seen all those pictures, advertisements. "Sit down," John said, finally letting go of Eric. The men sank down on the bench. I wanted to talk to you in a more discreet way. But now that I've seen you so close and I know it's you, I can't keep quiet. You have to hear this." Eric looked at John anxiously. He saw this man in person for the first time. "He's acting so strangely," the owner. "People around him used to describe him as rational to the core. But now his behavior is alarming. Could it be that this man is not healthy?" John took a breath, pulled himself together, calmed down, and began his long narrative with a story about his childhood. The boy had a hard time, then a drunken father, an indifferent mother, and no money. And the boy dreamed of a completely different life. The kind of life he had no chance of having. The only close person who understood John better than anyone else was his friend Eric. A boy with a similar fate who lived in the neighborhood. The boys were dreaming, making plans, always thinking about the future. They really wanted to get rich. Both surprisingly good for kids from dysfunctional families. They went to school. John excelled in the exact sciences, and Eric showed talents in the humanities. That's how they later divided responsibilities. John was in charge of finance and business planning, while the creative Eric was in charge of negotiations, public relations, advertising, and design. Yeah, poor guys from poor families eventually realized their dream. They opened a cafe. They earned the money to get started on their own, worked day and night wherever they could. They started early from the age of 12. They realized that they had to work hard and for a long time, otherwise they could not earn money for their dream. We didn't spend what we earned. At first, they saved the money in a secret stash, and then, when they became adults, they opened their own bank account. Eventually, by the age of 20, the friends opened a cafe. The name was thought up by Eric, who was the creative leader and idea generator in their tandem. Urban legend, it sounded solid and promising. John liked it right away. Eric, who had an artistic flair and impeccable taste, also worked on the interior of the cafe. Where did a child of drunken parents just come from? Eric decorated the walls of the visitors' lounge with paintings of his own authorship. He has been drawing since childhood. Over the years, this talent became stronger and stronger, and he kept honing his mustache. The budget at first was minimal, But Eric managed to recreate a special atmosphere in the cafe, exquisitely respectable, attractive. The boy guessed, realized what interiors would attract visitors. Clients were drawn immediately. Then in their city, there was no such competition as there is now. Today, it is harder for newcomers to enter the business, but in those days, the urban legend was very favorably distinguished from other similar establishments by its interesting environment. People liked to spend time here. The first profits came in. Friends by mutual decision let money into circulation, improved and expanded their brainchild. They had to work day and night, worry, take risks. But it was definitely worth it. John and Eric trusted each other completely. They were probably the closest people to each other in the whole world. Despite both having parents, and doing business together didn't ruin that friendship, as many people had predicted. Yes, there were, of course, occasional disputes and disagreements, but the young owners of the prosperous cafe always found a way out of the conflict. Besides, they both realized that in disputes the truth is born, and did not view them as something negative. Anton was a real business shark, rational, principled, sometimes tough. He chose only those options that were immediately profitable for their cafe and ruthlessly noted the others. Victor, on the other hand, was characterized from childhood by gentleness and humanity. He preferred to give people a second chance to motivate people with carrots rather than ropes. By the way, such behavior in many cases also turned out to be beneficial for the urban legend. True, not always in the short term. The friends complemented each other, making a perfect whole. They were business partners and brothers in life. You don't remember any of this at all. John looked at Eric with hopeful eyes, but he shook his head negatively. I've already figured out where this is going. I am that Eric, but it's all so vague. I recall some episode from a past life. I'm sitting in a tree high up in the summer, and there's a boy below. A friend of mine, I guess, wearing a plaid red shirt and cut-off jean shorts. Somehow I can see him clearly. That's me asking for it, John. I'm that boy. You probably sit in an old apple tree outside of town, open the apples and give them to me, and I pick them. Were you always more agile? I couldn't climb that tree. But you're like a squirrel. In a moment you're on top, where the biggest and sweetest apples grow. Eric smiled. From that attention, albeit fleeting, albeit vague, a pleasant warmth spread through his body, and John seemed close and almost family. The man didn't remember anything of what his master had told him, but his sensations were clearly changing. Eric no longer feared the chief. He was no longer a stranger to him. John, meanwhile, continued his story. The young businessmen were doing well. Soon the cafe turned into a restaurant, which was becoming more and more popular in the city. They were already being visited by distinguished guests, local celebrities, rich people, and businessmen. The profile of the institution was rapidly changing. All this, quite naturally, was reflected in the profits. Soon John and Eric were able to buy good apartments, expensive cars. Now they could afford vacations by the sea, good clothes. Everything was exactly as they had once dreamed it would be when they were still children. Of course, problems also appeared. The competitors were not slumbering. They were constantly giving the successful businessmen friends unpleasant surprises. Then the rumor of poisoning in the restaurant, then the farm building set on fire, then threats on the phone. Not everyone was ready to put up with the fact that the city legend was constantly coming to the forefront, overshadowing other similar establishments. So when Eric suddenly disappeared, John immediately assumed that it was the work of ill-wishers, their colleagues. He reported it to the police, where he went as soon as he realized that his friend had disappeared without a trace. The police had been shaking the suspects for some time, losing precious days and weeks. It was much later, when the media released a tip on Eric, that John was contacted by the same girl. She called the number listed in the missing persons ad. She was afraid to go straight to the police. Sobbing, the girl told John that she thought she had seen Eric the night he disappeared. John rushed over to this Desai. She's the one who told him the truth. Young girl was taking a cab back from the club tonight, decided to save money. So she walked home alone, not a smart decision. What can you take from a 17-year-old girl? And of course, near the embankment, she was accosted by a group of tipsy guys who wanted to continue the evening. Then she realized she was in trouble. She even lost her voice from fear. Images of a terrible future flashed through her head. Soon enough, Guys were reaching for her, grabbing her roughly, laughing hoarsely. Desi was shaking like a leaf. She rightly believed that she could not wait for rescue at such a time, but the girl was mistaken. Luckily for Daisy, Eric was coming home at the same time, and on foot too. He'd been at the bar and now he was walking home, enjoying the freshness of early morning or late night. That was a matter of opinion. Eric and John used to vacation and have fun together, but John had recently started a family. He married a quiet, beautiful girl who had gotten a job with them as a waitress a couple years ago, and now the happy newlyweds were expecting a baby boy. So Eric went out either alone or with other buddies. He understood. John's family life had started, and he didn't have time to party yet. His best friend had promised that Eric would be godfather to his firstborn. Of course, Eric couldn't get past Desi's distress. He wasn't that kind of man. The guy immediately understood everything, assessed the situation, and, despite the obvious preponderance of forces, rushed to the defenseless man's aid. "Have I always been like this?" Eric asked. "Since I was a kid," John smiled. "I can't imagine you doing anything differently." A fight broke out. She watched in horror as her savior was hit from all sides. It was unlikely that he could do anything alone against such a crowd. One of the scum was still clutching her shoulders with his strong hands. Eric held his own. As an adult, he had already fulfilled his long-time childhood dream of practicing karate. His parents, of course, could not afford to pay for his son's training. Or rather, they did not really want to spend money on nonsense. But now, as an adult, an established man, Eric was doing well in the gym. He had always been known for his agility and strength. Eric's skills came in handy at this dangerous moment. But he was alone, and there were 5 or 6 of them. Daisy couldn't remember the exact number of attackers. Suddenly, the guy holding Daisy down loosened his grip and rushed to the aid of his own dot. They were clearly unable to cope with Eric's sudden onslaught. Daisy didn't wait for the outcome of the fight and immediately slipped into the maze of sleeping streets. As she ran away, she saw one of the attackers hit her savior in the back of the head with a bottle, and he fell like a dead man. Why didn't Daisy call the police then? She was scared, shocked out of her mind. Back at the college dormitory, Daisy didn't say anything to anyone. She tried to convince herself that what had happened wasn't true. It had never happened, and even almost succeeded in doing so. But then she saw the very same orientation papers on the guy who'd saved her from the bullies. He himself seemed to have disappeared now, and the 2 incidents were clearly firmly linked. Daisy held on for a few more days. She was afraid to go to the police, and she felt guilty. But her conscience wouldn't let her rest. What if her testimony could help find this Eric? He didn't hesitate to rush to her defense. She's afraid to even share information. John immediately picked up the girl and took her to the police, where Daisy was questioned for several hours. Now, the criminal investigation officers had a clue. Most likely the guy died that night, and the body of the attackers hid somewhere. It took the police a long time to find the body. Yeah, they stunned Eric, got scared of what they'd done and dumped him senseless in the river. The current was swift, they wouldn't have found him soon enough, and assumed he'd drowned drunk. How many such cases are there? Divers explored the river for many kilometers downstream, but the body was never found. The search ended without any results. Everything pointed in Eric's favor. But John, he couldn't be completely sure. Those bastards, they said it was like Eric was alive when they dumped him in the water, just unconscious. On the other hand, why isn't Eric coming back if he's alive? Maybe he's become profoundly disabled, can't explain to others who he is. By the way, John also considered the version with memory loss. But it seemed very unrealistic to him, movie-like even. John continued to look for his friend on his own. Over the years, the police had lost interest in the case because of its futility. So the search for the body was just for show. John that did not give up. The man hired private detectives. True, their labors did not bear any fruit. But John wanted to believe that he at least did his best for his friend, getting used to the world. It was hard without Eric. Friends, after all, they'd been together almost since birth. John felt devastated and depressed. But life had taken its toll. The business had to grow. What was much harder to do now without a loyal companion? And then John had a son. and the world was painted with new colors. The happy father didn't think long about the name. He immediately decided to name his firstborn son Eric in honor of a friend. The wife did not object. The young mother also liked the name. And here you are, John, looking at Eric with burning eyes. Of course, to legalize, you will have to go through a lot of all sorts of procedures. Take a DNA test, examined completely. But I see it. I know it's you, and that scar on your cheek. You got it on a construction site when we were busting our asses for startup money for the cafe, and a childhood memory of the apple tree. I didn't tell you that, you remembered it. The look, the facial expressions, the way you moved. I'd given up hope of ever seeing you again. And then this is a miracle. Camping, sunny steps. Something unimaginable was going on in his head right now. John's story triggered an avalanche of memories. They rolled up first like sea waves on the shore, and then went in an endless stream. It was confusing, even frightening. Scraps of phrases, separate episodes, some names. Hearing a familiar phrase, John was alarmed. This campground was long gone. But before Eric's accident, they'd planned to celebrate his birthday there. Victor had been looking forward to the party, preparing, worrying about making sure the invitees liked everything, and returned. John looked at his friend with a smile. You're going to be the godfather now. I've taken my time with the affair, as I knew I would, with the Christinas, though my wife insisted. But only you were to be godfather, and now is the time.